It sounds pretty wild, but I really haven't played with a paddle this complete with this many perks in a long time. And now, halfway through 2025, Honolulu Pickleball might have just dropped our frontrunner for Paddle of the Year, a first-in-class, notched, dual-density, 100% foam core J2NF series. I can confidently say there's nothing else that plays like these paddles in terms of performance alone, and that's before factoring in what looks like elite durability and a surprisingly fair price that put these paddles in a league of their own. I'll cover all three of the notched foam paddles in this video, and with the discount code PBMED for the J2NF and NFT, and PBMED-Kevlar for the J2NFK, K for Kevlar, you can grab any of them for $175, which is an incredible overall value, making these the most affordable full foam paddles on the market right now. I'll go over some need-to-know specs, my J2NFK dissection, and then get into some gameplay and actual performance. All three of these notched foam paddles come 16 millimeters thick and hybrid shaped, measuring roughly 16.2 by 7.8 inches with a 5.5 inch handle. As mentioned before, these paddles don't have the classic honeycomb core, and instead they have a couple different foam types, which I'll show closer in my dissection, all molded together via thermoformed heating. Aside from measurements and cores otherwise being the same, these models differ mainly in their face layups. The J2NF, which was being called the J2NFL before they dropped the L, has a carbon fiber fiberglass carbon fiber layup. The J2NFT has a carbon fiber PET electroplated fiber, aka titanium, layup, and the J2NFK is the Kevlar face model. I'll put some measured stats on the screen here for you to pause and look at closer if you like, and I'll focus on a few specs here. First of all three of these paddles have incredibly low swing weights, which is wild considering how much power they produce, and despite the firepower, they're easy to whip around, just like earlier J2 models, and in typical Honolulu fashion, those low swing weights are paired with exceptionally high twist weights, a combo that absolutely shouldn't be overlooked. Now, looking at twist weight alone doesn't tell the whole story, especially when trying to correlate that number to sweet spot size, and to do so, you really have to look at that number like twist weight in the context of paddle construction, especially with all foam builds which naturally reduce vibration and often increase energy return. To give some perspective, in a Gen 2 paddle like the Mach 2 Forza, a twist weight of 7.0 or higher usually means a strong sweet spot and good stability. For a Gen 3 paddle with more foam, like the Picklin Electo Gen 3, a solid twist weight might be closer to a 6.5 or higher. While in a Gen 4 100% foam core paddle, that number can drop even further while still delivering elite sweet spot and performance. Now, if you consider the J2NF models into that progression, their twist weights are impressive even without considering the full foam construction, but once you factor that in, the result is, in my opinion, some of the largest, most forgiving sweet spots on the market. This is probably a good time to transition into my dissection to explain some of the construction and why these paddles do what they do. So if you find that part boring, feel free to skip this part for mile per hour and RPM measurements and actual gameplay performance after this. Like usual, I talked pretty heavily with Justin, aka King of the Nerds, to figure out a lot of this stuff, and he actually put together a good video on foam related topics with Braden. If you want to learn more about these things, it's a really helpful video. When I went to pull the face off, instead of coming cleanly, the bottom was adhered so tightly to the core that it just came off in strips of various depth. This was a little deflating, but still informative. It may be hard to see, but you can see the fibers coming off of that Kevlar, which is much more soft than anything I've ever seen in a carbon fiber face. And you can see why Kevlar over time tends to have more of a softening period than other face types tend to do. You compare that to the carbon fiber layers underneath, which appear much more rigid, much more pokey looking, so to speak, than the softer layers of that Kevlar. Since the core is 100% foam and there's no honeycomb, it obviously can't core crush, so our next question about durability is a disbonding from the face and the core. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is not going to be an issue here. Since all the components of the paddle are put together in the mold and those inner foam beads are expanded and heated right next to that face and they actually make contact in the thermoforming step, it adhered so tightly that it was just a super big pain to try and get off. I ended up just quitting and turning off my camera for that. That's in comparison to a paddle like the carbon TruFoam, where the cores are made individually and then afterwards the face is put on. That came off with not too much effort. Not super easy, but it wasn't super hard, at least definitely not like this. I ended up getting a carbide tipped sander and putting that on my Dremel tool, which ended up working pretty well to get the rest of the face off. After I got that face off, you can see that there's a notable space between that outer foam, which is a softer EVA foam, and that inner core, which is more of a hard foam. Plenty of movement going on here, which didn't need to be broken free by me at all, and probably explains one of the reasons why there isn't a notable break-in in these paddles, at least not in the typical Gen 3 way. The center foam in the J2NF actually feels a lot like the carbon TruFoam core. As you can see here, neither of them compress, and they both sound the same too, which I'll play now. The outer foam is more squishy and feels pretty close to what the foam in the rhombus ripple feels like. I cut these foams into rectangular prisms so I can measure length, width, and height for volume, which I then divided by that shape's mass to calculate the foam density. Comparing those to previous foams I've measured, the density of the harder inner core foam was just a little bit below that of the TruFoams. And then that softer EVA foam was one of the least dense foams that I've measured to this point, which probably again explains why at 16 millimeters thick, the J2NFs can stay so light. I did want to expose and inspect that outer thermal-formed edge foam, but to my surprise, that layer did not go all the way around the paddle like I thought it did. Instead, I found it went up the handle and just a few inches further and then stopped. My thought here is that the lower portion of the yellow edge guard foam and its associated carbon fiber enclosure serves to reinforce the handle and the neck of the paddle, but then stops where that reinforcement isn't needed anymore to save some unnecessary weight further towards the head of the paddle. So overall, this was a very interesting dissection here, which showed me a few things such as how unlikely disbonding would be in these paddles, why there isn't much of a break-in, and some unexpected findings that further strengthen this paddle's argument for premier durability, which is truly unmatched right now. To transition back to how these paddles actually performed in actual testing and gameplay, I'll put a summary chart on the screen now as an intro into the major must-know takeaways. For overall playability, I put all three of these models in the power category. Relative to each other, the J2NF and J2NFK have stronger pop and power, and the J2NFT has a slightly more soft feel on the face and lower pop than the other two, and conversely, the highest level of control. Sweet spot and stability is exceptional and pretty much the same in all three of these models. While a large difference between the three is the feel off the face, which I would describe as crisp, snappy, and lively in the J2NF, while the J2NFT is relatively more soft, muted, and the least crisp of these three. And the J2NFK has a pop that's pretty close to the J2NF, but has more of that classic Kevlar type feel that's a little more hard to put into words. You may find the numbers of their PBCoR results interesting, and while this test has its flaws, each of these paddles measured right at the edge of USAP's pop and power limits, with the cutoff at 0.43 rounded to the nearest hundredth. The J2NF in particular came in just 0.001 below the threshold. Any higher and it would have failed and been out of spec for tournament play. In terms of mile per hour measurements, I'll put a little comparison chart on the side of the screen here, which I did think translated accurately to gameplay, putting these below the 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒌 Force and Ripples, but just above other foam-enhanced paddles like the TruFoams and the Gearbox GX2s. RPMs were impressive, but not just from the baseline. Thanks to their lightweight and quick handling, it's easy to generate spin right at the kitchen line too. As an overview of how these felt in actual gameplay, these paddles were extremely easy to pick up and play well with right off the bat, and I think the spectrum of players that are going to enjoy playing with these is huge. One thing the J2K may have been missing, which was pretty unanimously voted the paddle of the year last year, is a bit of bite in the pop and power department. The J2NF series keeps that same shape and stability of the J2K, and probably do that better to be honest, but they all have a much better attackability profile, which makes this much more appealing for both advanced players and players ready to upgrade from a softer generation of paddles. I think the fact that these have huge sweet spots and that the effort to power correlation is pretty linear make these very predictable to play with and keeps them much more friendly to use than paddles like the Rhombus Ripple or the 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒌 Force, so players at various levels are going to be able to play with these much easier. I really just can't stress enough how stable and forgiving these paddles are, which is such a huge plus to a group of paddles that can produce this much firepower and stay so lightweight. That's incredibly rare. And not that this will last forever, but all three of these models were incredibly gritty feeling coming out of the box as well. My personal favorite was the carbon fiber J2NF. I thought it had a little bit more attackability than the NFT, and though the pop was pretty comparable to the J2NFK, I thought the carbon fiber face had a bit more of a pleasant feel. It was incredibly easy to adjust to, even coming from testing a lot of other paddles in different shapes and construction types, and the more I played with it, the harder it was to put down. It had just about everything I wanted. The hand speed, the counter pop, the predictable resets and control. I just didn't have to overexert myself to get what I wanted out of this paddle. I think the J2NFT, the PET titanium version, has a really good spot in this series too. It's less poppy and a little more soft than the other two paddles, so while still being in the lower end of the power range, it's still a bit more easy to control than the other two, so if you want to move into that power category but don't want to go full on in with it with the pop, this may be one of the better choices for you. Honestly, the J2NFK might be a good choice for a lot of people, but I just preferred the feel of the carbon fiber face better. Out of the box, the Kevlar and the carbon fiber versions had very similar pop, but having tested a ton of Kevlar paddles at this point, one thing that Kevlar material faces tend to do over time is they usually soften up a little bit, which makes the feel of those faces much more pleasant over time, but also lowers their pop level. And therefore, I would expect the final landing point of the J2NFK to have a pop level that's more in between the NFT and the carbon fiber NF versions. Otherwise, not a ton of differences there. I played with the paddles in this series side by side and interchangeably in games with other foam enhanced paddles like the carbon TruFoams, the Gearbox GX2s, the 11624 Powers, and the GRUVN Move It solid foam paddles, all without added weight, and without a doubt, the J2NF had more drive speed, pop, and attackability than all of these models, while the other two models neared the top of each chart in the categories as well. I think two of the most standout full foam paddles on the market right now are the carbon TruFoam and the J2NF, so comparing those two directly, the feel and energy return of the J2NF is a lot more consistent across the entire paddle face, while the TruFoam performs best right there in the middle, which is likely due to a smaller area of fiberglass placement in the TruFoam versus the fiberglass layer that spans the whole face in the J2NF. The feel of the TruFoam is a lot more muted, while the J2NF by comparison is less muted and a little more familiar feeling while keeping the feedback and vibrations on the low side. Overall, I think the paddles in the J2NF series are going to be wildly popular and are a clear upgrade in performance and durability compared to most paddles on the market. Though all of them have their place, my personal favorite is the J2NF due to the feel of the face and its ability to maintain good pop and power. You may also consider the J2NFK if you like the feel of Kevlar, or the J2NFT if you want slightly lower pop and a softer feeling face. These aren't the tippy top of power or pop, so if you want that or more of an exponential effort to power correlation ratio, you should look more in the direction of the Ripples or the YOLO Force. That same aero hybrid shape that gives these paddles their incredibly high stability also gives them a shorter handle and somewhat of a wider face taper down there on the bottom, so if you're dead set on using two full hands for your backhand, that also might be a roadblock for you here. Otherwise, it's hard to find things to complain, and I think these paddles are really going to take off and be incredibly popular through the rest of this year. That's my take on the J2NF, NFK, and NFT series by Honolulu Pickleball. I hope the review was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and I'll catch you here for the next one.